The unsurpassed, penetrating, and perfect truth is seldom met with, even in 100,000 myriad kalpas. Now we can see and hear it. We can remember and accept it. I vow to make the Buddha's truth one with myself. So this morning, I'd like to talk about fear of death. Reverend Master Dogen tells us that the most important question for all Buddhists is how to understand birth and death completely. For then, should you be able to find the Buddha within birth and death, they both vanish. In the Pali Canon, 5 great fears are identified. And the first of them is fear of death, which of course is actually a fear of loss of me. Then there's fear of losing control of our mind. Am I going to turn into a dotty old lady overnight? Yeah. Fear of loss of reputation. What will others think of me? Fear of loss of livelihood. Will I ever find another job? Or fear of public speaking. Will I make a fool of myself? Have you heard people say, when asked to give a speech, I'd rather die? So it's kind of an interesting thing. So today I'd like to talk about death, and in particular about our fear of death. And I'm going to start by talking about what I'm familiar with. I could say that I've been preparing for this talk for about 70 years. Maybe a little less than that. But it was that early in my life that I developed an absolute hysterical terror of death. Not that I knew anything, but maybe that makes it worse. When I was a little kid, maybe, 6, 7 years old enough to read, I walked into the kitchen. I lived with my grandparents, and there was a magazine on the middle of the kitchen table, and in big letters, it said, Life. I don't think that magazine exists any longer, but so someone had given my grandparents a subscription to Life, and this was the first issue. And I do not know why I made this connection, but I thought, is there another one called death? I was somewhat familiar with seeing death because we had chickens, and when they stopped laying eggs, my grandfather would kill them for the meal. But I never associated seeing that with anything that had to do with people at all. So I was born just about the end of World War II, and I was raised by my grandmother. And during the war, all across the country, the blackout was enforced at night so that enemy planes couldn't see where houses were, buildings were. And so we had these blackout shades that you pulled down. And since my grandmother didn't have a lot of money and the shades were in perfect condition, actually I lived there for 16 years and we still were using those blackout shades. But at night I'd go to bed. I was, probably about 7, and I'd get tucked in and the door would close and it would be absolutely pitch black. Nothing. Kind of like black velvet. No sign of anything. And our street had no street lights anyway, so it wouldn't have helped. And I somehow made the connection with this life-death business. And I thought, this must be what it's like to be dead. To be conscious and in a surrounding where there are there's apparently nothing else except complete blackness. And I used to get hysterical even thinking about it. I gradually tried to train myself, it's like don't think the thought. But finally I asked my grandmother, couldn't we just leave my door open a little crack so that there would be, I knew that there was a there and I wasn't abandoned. And that helped a lot. The first human death that I had anything to do with is when my grandfather died, which wasn't a whole lot after. It was probably about the same time. He had severe arthritis, and like many people do, he fell and cracked his hip, went to the hospital, and very quickly pneumonia set in, and just within a few days he died. I didn't know anything about why or what happened at the time. I just remember my grandmother coming to me and she said, "Dad died last night." That was it. So, but when you're a kid, you accept how things are happening as being normal. So, and a few days later, the house filled up with all the family and there was going to be a funeral, and someone had to stay behind with me because it was deemed unsuitable for a child to have anything to do with a funeral. And then I grew up and I didn't really give a whole lot of thought to any of this, except throughout my life when I'd get in bed at night and close my eyes, that hysteria could set in, that this fear that when I died I would be abandoned for eternity in the middle of nothing. So when I was 22 years old, we got a phone call one evening. I was living on my own by this time, and it was to say that my grandmother, who had raised me, had died. And that night I got in bed, and all I could think of was my gentle, kind, loving, shy grandmother was lying exposed on a table somewhere, having things done. And I literally got hysterical. I couldn't stop crying. It was, it was difficult. So then I continued on into my adulthood, and I still would have that fear arising. It continued to come up, not all the time, just sporadically, probably till I was in my 40s, which is about the time, coincidentally, that I bumped into Reverend Master Jiyu and began a Buddhist practice. And I'm going to switch gears right here. From a very early age, we learn about the step on the, what's it called? Dependent origination, the step called becoming. And I'm going to skip to what happens to children when it comes to things like death and whatnot, in this world of becoming. Because we, from an early age, are trained to become. We get asked, "How old are you?" And you go, "When's your birthday? What are you going to do on your birthday? What do you want for Christmas? What are you going to be when you grow up?" Not, "What have you been doing lately?" Or anything like that. Always looking ahead. That's what we teach our children, is to always look ahead. Plan for the future, anticipate things, or dread things. We continue that through our life. When we're in junior high school, we can hardly wait to be one of the big kids. When one of the big kids, we want to go to college. When I was 7 years old, I knew what college I was going to. It's always this living out in the future. When we're an adult, we're looking for our first job or a better job or a newer job. We're looking for a big party that's coming in 2 weeks, and how often do you count the days until your vacation starts? And all of these things that we do that keep us out in the future. And then, and I can again attest to this from personal experience, there becomes a point in your life where the topic of becoming is different. You're no longer looking forward to what you're going to do on your summer vacation. You're looking forward to what are you going to do because your knee hurts all the time. And gradually, all of the things that change, it's kind of the opposite of a body maturing, those things start happening, and we begin to anticipate how awful it could be in the future. Not all of us, but many of us do such a thing. So we've tied ourselves throughout life of always being somewhere other than where we are. And of course, when we're talking about things that we're looking at in the future, there are the things that are on the dread side, death being one of them. I'm going to break death actually into three pieces, because in my mind it has three separate sort of stages or something, or activities. We're all dying right now, is that right? And dying is a process. It's a process that keeps going throughout our entire life. From the minute we pop out till the minute we die, we are dying. Even what we think of as death still is a process. There is a moment at which death appears. Before that we were dying. After death, we're dead. My daughter and I were privileged to be with my mother when she died. We just thought we were visiting her on a Sunday afternoon at the nursing home, but by that point she was quite demented, and she was pretty agitated that day. And so they got her into bed and settled her comfortably, and lo and behold, she started dying. And what was interesting to me was there came a point when she had stopped being agitated and was lying there comfortably. We got her on one side so she could breathe more easily. And she stopped breathing. So I went out to the nursing station and said, "Excuse me, my mother just stopped breathing." And a nurse came in, put a stethoscope on her chest and said, "Not yet." And so even what appeared to be death wasn't. And then, of course, maybe 20 minutes later, she came back and pronounced her dead. This is the first time I'd ever sat with a dead person before. It took a while for the people from the funeral home who were going to do the cremation. It took them a couple of hours to get there. And I can remember my daughter just sitting there. We had cups of tea, and so we're sitting there with my mother, just chatting and drinking tea. And so that gave me a much different view of death than the one I'd had from my earlier experiences. That although she may have been really upset and agitated beforehand, she actually settled down and kind of got to it, you might say. Then there's dead. That's the one I dreaded. That may be why many religions, all the way from formal religions to folk religions, and how many different words are there for heaven? You know, there's happy hunting ground, and there's all of these things. But this idea, again, you know, like we've got a reservation someplace, and now we're going to go there. It's the idea of being dead, sort of with a period after it. I have a very brief thing in this book which summarizes something from the Pali Canon. For example, there is an inquiry made to a monk called Aniruddha, where he's questioned by some Brahmin scholars on what is the nature of an enlightened being after death. What happens to a Tathagata, an enlightened one, after the death of the body? Do they exist? The monk replies, "This is not spoken of by the enlightened one." He is asked, "Well, do they not exist?" "This is not spoken of by the enlightened one." "Well, do they both exist and not exist?" "This is not spoken of the enlightened one either," he replies. "Then do they neither exist nor not exist?" "This too," he says, "is not spoken of by the enlightened one." So they say to him, "You must be a fool or one who is newly gone forth. You obviously do not understand the Buddha's teaching, or you would have been able to give us a decent answer." Then he goes to the Buddha and tells him of the conversation he had with these people, and he asks, "Did I answer in the right way?" And the Buddha said, "Yes, Aniruddha, you answered well." So, isn't that a relief? One less thing to worry about there. Fortunately for us, as I proved true for myself, when this panic, returning panic, started oozing away, and just, I haven't had that happen in a long time, most of the Buddha's teachings, actually, the things that we're taught to do, to examine, practice with, are the very things that help us in whatever our own dying process turns out to be. And strangely enough, our practice focuses so much on what we do every day, just the ordinary activities of daily life. And those are exactly what we need to focus on to prepare for our death. When we're doing seated meditation, neither trying to think nor not to think, that's our practice for being fully present in the moment now, in the moment when we have pneumonia. I know from my own experience, as many of you know, I've had a couple of cancer surgeries. And I used to dread the word cancer. Anything else but that. But you know, when the time came, the practice we do here, it's like saying, well, okay, so this is what we're doing now, you know. Mindfulness practice as part of our daily life meditation is what will help us in the time when we're facing the immediate death, when we're ill, when we're incapacitated. Because it's usually just fine to be now. What's scary is what might happen. So if you don't have to think about it, that's a great relief right there. We're fortunate that we live where we live and in this age, because one of the things we don't have to worry about is dying in the midst of excruciating pain. You know, we can receive help in those kinds of situations. I can't even imagine facing weeks of terrible pain, but it seems to be quite well dealt with now, and there's even a whole area of medicine, palliative care medicine, which will help us. The wisdom teachings, which tell us about the two kinds of truth that we live with, you know, the relative truth, the truth of just our daily life, the activities, the things that happen, whether we're comfortable, uncomfortable, all of those things, the things that help us navigate this world are one form of truth. The wisdom teachings teach us about ultimate truth. The truth that in fact dying, our being born, growing up, living, and then gradually dying started a long time before we were born, and it will continue for an eternity after we're no longer here, because everything is moving, everything is coming and going, growing, diminishing. And we sing it every morning. We sing, in the mind of the Bosatsu who is truly one with wisdom great, the obstacles dissolve. All of the things that we might worry about, all of the cares, all of the sense of ourself as this precious, separate being who needs to have exactly the right things, whose feelings get hurt, who get angry. When we just sit in the midst of ultimate truth, those things certainly do dissolve. How many times have you gone into a quiet place, either in your room, you know, on a beach, in a forest? I had a coworker who loved to go fishing, because if she sat there with a fishing pole in her hand, she had an excuse for just sitting there. And she would just sit there and open up to the quiet. And I think we've all had experiences where we sat there and the usual preoccupation with the past, the future, what are we going to do, what I want, what I don't want, it all dissolves and you're just sitting there in this great pool of silence. It might last a minute, it might last longer than that. But we all have had that experience. And that experience is completely available to us as we're lying there in the process of dying. I was always intrigued by the title of Reverend Master Jiu's first book, Zen is Eternal Life. It took me quite a few years to figure out, at least for me, what I thought she may have meant. But for me, when we sit, whether it's in a hall, in a car, or on the, out in front of the waves on a beach, when we sit in that great stillness, we are sitting in the midst of eternal life. And we don't need a beach. It's accessible everywhere. Birth is a natural event and death is a natural event. Having lived with a lot of cats, I have a firm belief that each one of us actually, left to our own devices and not having us having someone tell us what to do. Each of us knows how to die. It's part of being alive. When animals die, they know exactly what they need. You know, my old cat retreated to the closet where he'd never been. When I came back from something, he would teeter out and say hello and teeter back in until one day I came home and he had died. So he wasn't stressed. He wasn't panicking. He knew exactly what to do. Are we different? I don't think so. So death is the great mystery, isn't it? All I can hope is that we will all greet it with an open heart, because we have a choice when it comes. We can either die looking up, or we can die looking down. It's a choice. Thank you.